He entered a forbidden forest to earn money and save his dying wife. Instead, he heard a scream that should not exist. Deep in the mountains, he found an injured Bigfoot, trapped and bleeding. What happened next changed his life forever. This is not a legend. This is a story about a choice worth more than gold. He went into the mountains before dawn because daylight brought rules, and rules had stopped saving his wife. Elijah Cole shut off the engine of his battered pickup and sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking of hot metal as it cooled. The logging road stretched behind him like a scar carved into the forest, but ahead there was nothing but trees, shadow, and cold. The kind of cold that slipped through layers of clothing and settled deep in the bones, reminding a man he was alive whether he wanted to be or not. 42 years old. That was all he was. 42 and already living with the kind of fear that aged people twice as fast. His reflection stared back at him from the cracked side mirror. Dark skin drawn tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes ringed with exhaustion, a beard peppered with early gray he didn't remember earning. He looked older than he felt, and weaker than he'd ever been. Elijah stepped out of the truck and closed the door softly, as if the forest were sleeping and might wake angry if he made too much noise. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar ache there, then lifted his chainsaw from the back seat. The weight was comforting, honest. Wood didn't lie. Trees didn't pretend. You cut them right, they fell. You cut them wrong, they killed you. This land wasn't his. He knew that. Federal forest, protected zone, posted signs he'd learned to avoid years ago. But protection didn't pay hospital bills, and signs didn't sit at a bedside holding a woman's hand while machines breathed for her. Marilyn's face rose uninvited in his mind, just as it always did. Her smile from before the sickness. The way she laughed with her whole body. The way she'd said, "Don't do anything stupid, Elijah," when he told her he'd figure something out. He hadn't told her what that something was. He couldn't. She already carried enough weight in her chest without adding guilt. The doctors had been careful with their words, but the meaning had been clear. Kidney failure, complications. A transplant was possible. Treatment existed. Hope existed. But hope had a price tag with too many zeros. Elijah adjusted the straps of his pack and started walking. The forest closed around him quickly, swallowing the thin gray light of morning. Tall firs and ancient cedars towered overhead, their tops lost in mist. Fallen needles muffled his footsteps. Somewhere far off, a bird cried once, sharp and lonely, then went silent. He followed a path he'd memorized over years of quiet trespasses. Not a trail, not really. More like an agreement between him and the land. He didn't take more than he needed. He didn't linger. He didn't leave trash. He told himself that mattered. By the time the sun finally broke through the canopy, Elijah was deep enough that turning back would have felt like failure. He picked a stand of trees that had grown too close together, tall and straight, valuable timber if someone knew where to sell it quietly. He fueled the chainsaw, pulled the cord, and the engine roared to life, tearing through the morning calm. For hours, the work consumed him. Cut, fall, measure, limb. Sweat soaked through his clothes despite the cold. His muscles burned, but it was a familiar pain, the kind that reminded him he could still do something useful in a world that had taken almost everything else from him. It was sometime near midday when the sound came. At first he thought it was the chainsaw echoing strangely off the rock faces higher up the ridge. A distorted howl stretched and warped by distance. He shut off the engine and listened. The forest held its breath. Then the sound came again. It wasn't an animal call he recognized. Too deep for a wolf. Too raw for an elk. It carried a broken edge to it, like pain forced through a throat not built to make such sounds. Elijah felt the hair on his arms lift beneath his jacket. He told himself it was nothing. A wounded bear, maybe, or a mountain lion caught in a trap. Those screams happened sometimes. He'd heard stories, but this sounded different, closer, and wrong in a way he couldn't put into words. He should have left. Any sensible man would have. But sense didn't sit beside Marilyn's hospital bed. Sense didn't wake him up at night with the image of her eyes searching his face for reassurance. Elijah grabbed his axe and moved toward the sound. The terrain grew steeper as he climbed, rocks slick with moss, fallen logs half-rotted and treacherous underfoot. The smell hit him first. Blood, rust, wet earth. Then he saw the broken branches, snapped not by weather, but by something heavy thrashing in panic. The scream came again, closer now, and Elijah broke into a run. He burst into a small clearing and froze. At first, his mind refused to name what his eyes were seeing. It tried to rearrange it into something safer. A bear standing oddly, a trick of shadow, a nightmare pulled into daylight. Then the creature moved and denial shattered. It was enormous, taller than any man Elijah had ever seen, even hunched in pain. Broad shoulders covered in thick dark hair matted with mud and blood. Long arms straining against something metallic clamped around its lower leg. A trap, not for animals, for something much bigger. The creature roared again, and Elijah saw its face clearly. Not a snout, not a muzzle. A face that was wrong only because it was too right. Eyes dark and intelligent, wide with agony and fear. Teeth bared, not in threat, but in helplessness. Bigfoot. The words slammed into Elijah's thoughts like a curse. He had laughed at stories like this once. Campfire nonsense, grainy photos, people seeing what they wanted to see. But nothing about this was fuzzy or distant. It was real, bleeding, trapped, and not alone. Elijah's gaze snapped to the edges of the clearing. Boot prints in the dirt. Fresh, deep, human. Near them, empty energy drink cans and cigarette butts crushed into the soil. Someone had set this trap deliberately. Someone was coming back. The creature noticed Elijah then. Their eyes met. For one terrifying second, Elijah thought it would lunge at him, snap the trap free with brute force and tear him apart. He felt suddenly, brutally aware of how small he was, how fragile bones and skin really were. But the creature didn't attack. It stilled. Its breathing hitched, chest rising and falling hard. One massive hand lifted slightly, not in aggression, but something else, a hesitation, a plea so unmistakable it made Elijah's throat tighten. He stood there, axe trembling in his grip, heart hammering so loud he was sure the creature could hear it. If he ran now, he might make it back to his truck before anyone saw him. He could forget this, pretend he never came this way. No one would blame him. But Marilyn's face rose again, clear as if she were standing beside him. Don't do anything stupid, Elijah. Saving this thing was stupid, dangerous, illegal. He knew that, but walking away felt worse. He took a step forward. The creature flinched, a low sound rumbling from its chest, but it didn't strike. Elijah moved slowly, carefully, showing his hands just like he'd been taught around frightened animals. "It's okay," he heard himself say, voice shaking. "I'm not here to hurt you." The words felt ridiculous hanging in the cold air, spoken to something the world insisted didn't exist. But the creature watched him, eyes tracking every movement, and something in its expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but possibility. Elijah knelt beside the trap and saw what it was. Heavy steel jaws, reinforced chain, bolted into the ground with stakes. Industrial, expensive. Whoever had set it knew exactly what they were hunting. He swallowed and reached for the release mechanism. The creature tensed, muscles coiling, pain rippling through its massive body. Elijah paused, met its gaze again, and nodded once, as much to himself as to it. "I've got you," he whispered. The trap snapped open with a violent clank. The creature screamed, a sound of pure agony as its damaged leg came free, and Elijah was thrown backward by the sudden movement. Dirt and leaves exploded into the air as the massive form stumbled, caught itself, and staggered away a few steps. Elijah scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then the creature turned back. It looked at the broken trap, at Elijah, at the path leading deeper into the forest, away from the road, away from the men who would come back with guns and ropes. Slowly, deliberately, it straightened and lifted its head. And then, with a final look that burned itself into Elijah's memory, it turned and vanished into the trees. Elijah stood alone in the clearing, the ruined trap at his feet, his heart pounding, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Somewhere far off, human voices echoed faintly through the forest. He realized with a cold certainty settling in his gut, that saving the creature had only been the beginning, and that the forest had just changed the course of his life forever. Elijah did not run immediately. The forest around the clearing felt suddenly crowded, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to witness what he had done. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything else until a sharp crack of a branch snapped him back to reality. Human voices drifted through the woods, closer now, careless and loud in the way men sounded when they believed they owned the place they were standing in. Elijah, move, he muttered to himself. He grabbed his axe and plunged into the trees, not following any trail, letting instinct and years of reading terrain guide him. He moved downhill, then cut sharply to the east, putting uneven ground and thick brush between himself and the clearing. His lungs burned, cold air tore at his throat, but fear kept his legs moving. He had barely gone 100 yards when the first gunshot echoed behind him. The sound punched through the forest like a physical force. Birds erupted from the canopy. Another shot followed, then shouting, angry and excited. They had found the trap. They knew something had been there, and now they would want to know who. Elijah pushed harder, slipping on wet leaves, catching himself on tree trunks, tearing his jacket on thorns he barely felt. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to put distance between himself and those men. A sudden weight slammed into him from the side. He hit the ground hard, air exploding from his chest, the axe skidding out of reach. For one blind, panicked second, he thought the creature had come back to finish him, that mercy had been a mistake. Then he saw the eyes, dark, familiar, not furious. The Bigfoot loomed over him, breathing hard, one massive hand pressed against the ground inches from Elijah's head. The injured leg trembled, stained with fresh blood, but the creature ignored it, head turning toward the direction of the voices. Another gunshot rang out, closer now. The Bigfoot made a sharp, urgent sound, low and commanding, then seized Elijah by the collar of his jacket and hauled him upright with terrifying ease. Elijah barely had time to gasp before he was being pulled through the forest at a pace that felt impossible. Branches whipped past. The ground vanished beneath his feet. He stumbled, was lifted again, half carried, half dragged. The creature moved with a speed that defied its size, weaving through trees, ducking under fallen logs, avoiding open spaces with an instinct born of decades of hiding. They crossed a narrow ravine in a single leap that left Elijah's stomach behind. Water flashed below them, dark and fast. Elijah's heart felt like it might tear itself apart inside his chest. Behind them, the shouting grew confused, then distant. After what felt like an eternity, but could not have been more than minutes, the Bigfoot slowed. It guided Elijah into a hollow between massive boulders, thick with ferns and shadow. The creature shoved him gently down, then crouched, pressing a finger to its own chest, then to Elijah's, then holding still. Wait, Elijah understood. They stayed there in silence, broken only by the Bigfoot's heavy breathing and Elijah's own pulse roaring in his ears. Footsteps passed somewhere above them, close enough that Elijah could smell cigarette smoke drifting down through the rocks. A man laughed. Another cursed about a broken trap and wasted time. Minutes stretched thin. Elijah's muscles cramped from holding still. Sweat cooled on his skin, turning into a chill that seeped deep. Finally, the voices faded. The Bigfoot exhaled slowly and leaned back against the rock wall, its head tipping up as if the weight of the moment had finally caught up with it. Elijah dared to breathe normally again. Up close, the creature looked even more unreal. The rise and fall of its chest, the way its eyes flicked to every sound, the intelligence there, sharp and alert. This was no animal acting on instinct alone. The Bigfoot's gaze dropped to Elijah's hand, still shaking. It made a low, questioning sound. "I'm okay," Elijah whispered without thinking. "I think." The creature watched his mouth, then his eyes as if absorbing the meaning rather than the words. Slowly it nodded once. Elijah's thoughts crashed in on him all at once. What he'd done, what he'd seen, what he was now involved in. His wife, the money, the men with guns. "You shouldn't have come back," Elijah said quietly, voice breaking despite himself. "They were going to kill you." The Bigfoot's eyes held his for a long moment. Then it shifted, revealing the injured leg more clearly. The trap had torn deep. Blood soaked the fur, dark and sticky. Elijah swallowed hard. "Jesus," he murmured. "You're hurt bad." The creature made a dismissive sound, shaking its head, but its breathing betrayed it. Every movement sent a tremor through its body. Elijah dug into his pack with trembling fingers and pulled out his canteen. He held it up, unscrewed the cap slowly, offering it. The Bigfoot hesitated, then leaned forward and sniffed. Carefully, awkwardly, it took the canteen between two massive fingers and drank. Water spilled down its chin, darkening the fur. Elijah felt something tighten painfully in his chest. This thing trusted him. He didn't know why, but the weight of that trust felt heavier than any log he'd ever lifted. They stayed hidden until the light began to fade. When the forest finally settled back into its evening rhythm, the Bigfoot rose, testing its injured leg. It hissed softly, a sound of frustration and pain, then turned to Elijah and motioned with its head. "Follow." "I can't keep up with you," Elijah said, though he stood. "Not like before." The creature studied him, then adjusted its pace, moving slower, favoring the injured leg but still guiding them away from danger. They traveled until dusk turned the forest blue and then black, until Elijah's legs burned and his stomach twisted with hunger and fear. They reached a narrow cave tucked behind a curtain of hanging roots and moss, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The Bigfoot ducked inside, then paused, looking back at Elijah. Elijah hesitated only a second before following. Inside, the cave widened into a dry chamber, the stone walls etched with scratches and markings Elijah didn't recognize. The smell was earthy but clean, safe. The Bigfoot lowered itself carefully onto the ground, exhaustion finally overtaking it. Elijah sat opposite, unsure what else to do. For a long time, neither of them spoke or moved. Then the weight Elijah had been carrying all day finally crushed him. "My wife is dying," he said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. His voice echoed softly off the stone. "She needs treatment I can't afford. I was cutting wood out here because it's the only thing I know how to do that might get us money fast. I didn't come looking for you. I didn't come looking for trouble." The Bigfoot watched him, utterly still. "I don't even know why I'm telling you this," Elijah went on, rubbing his face with both hands. "You don't understand. You shouldn't understand." The creature shifted, then did something Elijah would never forget. It reached out and placed one massive hand gently against Elijah's chest. The touch was warm, steady, careful. The Bigfoot met his eyes, then slowly, deliberately, mimed a motion with both hands, as if lifting something heavy and offering it forward. "Give." Then it pointed at Elijah. Then it pressed its fist to its own chest. Something passed between them in that moment, wordless and undeniable. The creature withdrew its hand and slowly pushed itself to its feet. It turned toward the cave entrance, then looked back and tilted its head. "Follow me." Elijah stared at it, heart pounding with a new kind of fear. "Where?" he whispered. The Bigfoot didn't answer. It stepped out into the night, limping but determined, disappearing into the dark forest beyond. Elijah sat there for a moment longer, listening to the echo of his own breathing, then stood. He didn't know where the creature was taking him. He didn't know what waited deeper in the mountains, but something in his gut told him this was no longer just about survival. He grabbed his pack, shouldered it, and stepped out of the cave after the legend he had saved, and became a target beside. Night in the mountains was not empty. It was layered. Elijah felt it as soon as he stepped out of the cave, the way darkness stacked itself between the trees, the way distance dissolved and sound carried farther than it should. The Bigfoot moved ahead of him like a shadow given weight, limping but relentless, never once looking back to see if Elijah followed. It didn't need to. Whatever had passed between them in the cave had settled something unspoken. Elijah followed. They traveled without fire, without light, guided by moon glow filtering through the canopy and the creature's impossible sense of direction. Elijah stumbled more than once, bark scraping his palms, knees bruising against stone, but each time he faltered, the Bigfoot slowed, never touched him again, but never let him fall too far behind. Hours passed, or maybe only one long hour, stretched thin by fear and exhaustion. Elijah lost track of time. His thoughts drifted back to Marilyn, to the machines, to the sound of her breathing when she slept, shallow and uneven. He wondered if she would still be alive when he returned. The question sat in his chest like a stone. They climbed higher. The forest thinned, ancient trees giving way to exposed rock and twisted roots clinging stubbornly to the mountainside. Cold wind cut through Elijah's clothes now, sharper than before. Somewhere below them, far below, he could hear water rushing, a deep, constant roar. Finally, the Bigfoot stopped. They stood before a rock face that looked no different from 100 others Elijah had passed in his life. Jagged stone, dark streaks where rain had carved its path, moss and lichen clinging in stubborn patches. Nothing about it suggested significance. The Bigfoot turned and looked at him. Its eyes held urgency now. Not fear, not pain, purpose. It stepped forward and pushed aside a curtain of hanging ivy and dead branches Elijah hadn't even noticed. Behind it was a narrow opening, barely wider than Elijah's shoulders, descending steeply into darkness. A mine. Elijah's breath caught. Old ones dotted these mountains, relics of men who had chased gold until the land bled dry and then moved on. Most were collapsed, dangerous, forgotten. The Bigfoot gestured for him to follow. "I don't have a light," Elijah whispered, though he wasn't sure why he was whispering. The creature reached down and picked up a stone from the ground. It struck it once against the rock wall. Sparks jumped, faint but real. Elijah stared. Then the Bigfoot moved into the opening. The passage sloped downward sharply, the air growing colder with every step. Elijah slid more than walked, bracing himself against damp stone walls. His heart hammered, not from exertion now, but from something deeper. Anticipation tangled with disbelief. The tunnel widened suddenly. Elijah stepped into a cavern and stopped dead. Even in the dim light filtering down from the entrance, he could see it. Gold, not scattered flakes, not veins hidden in rock. Crates, wooden boxes stacked against the far wall, half rotted but intact enough to reveal what lay inside. Bars of dull yellow metal wrapped in oilcloth. Old canvas sacks slumped under their own weight, seams split just enough for coins to spill out onto the stone floor. His legs weakened. "No," he breathed. "No, this isn't real." The Bigfoot moved past him and lowered itself carefully to the ground, exhaustion finally overtaking it. It watched Elijah, its expression unreadable. Elijah stumbled forward, kneeling beside one of the open crates. His fingers trembled as he reached out and touched the metal. Cold, heavy, solid, gold. He had seen pictures before, museums, textbooks. Nothing prepared him for the reality of it, for the sheer density of value packed into such small shapes. His mind struggled to process what this meant. "How?" he whispered. "Why is this here?" The Bigfoot made a low sound and pointed at markings burned faintly into the crate. Elijah leaned closer. Dates, names, the late 1800s, early 1900s. Mining company names long dissolved. This wasn't some fantasy hoard. This was abandoned history. Elijah understood then. Men had pulled this from the mountain, stockpiled it, and never returned. Accidents, cave-ins, laws changing, death. The forest had swallowed their ambition whole, and the creature had found it, guarded it. The Bigfoot shifted and, with deliberate care, pushed one of the crates closer to Elijah. Then another. It reached into a sack and lifted a handful of coins, letting them spill slowly through its fingers back onto the stone. It looked at Elijah and pressed its fist to its chest, then extended its open hand toward him. A gift. Payment. Elijah's throat closed. "No," he said hoarsely. "I can't take all of this." The Bigfoot tilted its head, studying him. Elijah laughed once, broken and incredulous. "Do you even know what this is worth? This could destroy everything. People would come. Governments. Guns. They'd never leave you alone." The Bigfoot listened. It always listened. Elijah closed his eyes, breathing hard. Images flashed through his mind in brutal succession. Marilyn dying, Marilyn living, the hospital bills, the forest swarming with men like the ones who had set the trap. Rifles. Cages. He opened his eyes again. "I'll take some," he said quietly. "Only what I need. Enough to save her. Not enough to make noise." The Bigfoot watched him for a long moment. Then slowly it nodded. Relief crashed through Elijah so powerfully he nearly sobbed. He filled his pack carefully, choosing smaller bars, coins that could be passed quietly, sold gradually. His hands moved with reverence, not greed. Every piece felt like a promise and a threat wrapped into one. When he was done, he closed the pack and turned back. The Bigfoot was already on its feet, bracing itself against the wall. It looked weaker now, pale beneath the fur. The injury still bled slightly. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Elijah said. "Those men will come back." The Bigfoot shook its head. It pointed upward, then traced a path with its finger across the stone wall, a route only it could navigate. It would disappear again. Elijah nodded, understanding. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate, but all he had. The Bigfoot stepped forward and placed one massive hand on Elijah's shoulder. The weight of it was grounding, final. Then it turned and melted back into the darkness of the tunnel, moving with quiet determination despite its pain. Elijah stood alone in the cavern, pack heavy on his back, heart heavier still. By the time he emerged into the night air, the moon had climbed high. The forest stretched out below him, vast and indifferent, as if daring him to carry this secret back into the world of men. He didn't look back. He began the long journey home, knowing with a certainty that terrified him that nothing about his life would ever be simple again. Elijah did not go home the same way he had come. He avoided the logging roads, the trails, every place where a man might expect to see another man. He moved like someone who had learned, finally and irrevocably, that being seen was more dangerous than being lost. The pack on his back pulled at his shoulders with every step, not because of its weight alone, but because of what it represented. Hope was heavier than fear. Hope demanded responsibility. By the time he reached his truck, dawn was breaking again. 24 hours had passed since he had first heard the scream in the forest. It felt like a lifetime. Elijah sat behind the wheel for several minutes before turning the key, hands resting on the pack in the passenger seat, grounding himself in the reality of it. He half expected it to vanish, to reveal itself as some elaborate trick of exhaustion and grief. It did not. He drove. The next weeks unfolded carefully, deliberately, like a man defusing a bomb, one decision at a time. Elijah did not rush. He did not celebrate. He did not tell anyone. He took the gold apart, piece by piece, turning it into something the world would accept without asking too many questions. Old coins sold quietly to collectors. Small bars melted and recast through intermediaries who specialized in discretion. Cash appeared slowly, spread across accounts, justified through paperwork and patience. By the time the doctors called him back into the office, Elijah already knew what they were going to say. The surgery was possible, risky, expensive, but possible. He sat beside Marilyn's bed when they told her, watched her eyes fill with tears she tried to hide, watched the fight return to her face. She squeezed his hand the way she always had, grounding him, anchoring him to the world. "You did this," she whispered. "I don't know how, but I know you." He didn't answer. He just held her hand and let the machines hum around them. The surgery happened 3 weeks later. Elijah paced hospital corridors worn smooth by generations of prayers and fear. He stared at the same spot on the floor for hours. When the surgeon finally came out, mask lowered, exhaustion written into every line of his face, Elijah barely breathed. "She made it," the man said. "It's going to be a long recovery, but she made it." Elijah sank into a chair and covered his face with both hands. He didn't cry. He shook, the kind of shaking that came when a man realized the world had not ended after all. They moved, quietly, away from the mountains, away from the roads Elijah knew too well. He told people what they expected to hear: a lucky break, an old investment, a distant inheritance no one could verify. The story held because people wanted it to. People preferred simple explanations to uncomfortable truths. Marilyn healed, slowly at first, then steadily. Color returned to her skin. Strength returned to her voice. Laughter returned to their home. Elijah watched her sleep sometimes, just to remind himself that she was still there. And when he finally felt strong enough to face the forest again, he went back, not to take, to give. He returned alone, carrying no tools, no pack heavy with need. He left food where the Bigfoot had first sheltered him. Clean water, simple supplies. He never stayed long, never called out. He understood now that some boundaries were sacred. Once, just once, he saw him again. A silhouette on a distant ridge at sunset. Massive. Still. Watching. Elijah lifted a hand. The figure inclined its head. That was all. Years passed. Elijah grew older. The forest changed. Marilyn's hair grew streaked with gray, she wore proudly. Life settled into something gentle and earned. Elijah never spoke of what had happened. He never wrote it down. The world did not need proof. Some truths were meant to survive only in silence. Sometimes when the night was quiet and the wind moved through the trees just right, Elijah thought about the moment in the clearing, about a choice made without certainty, about a legend bleeding in the dirt, about how compassion, given freely, had returned multiplied. He had gone into the forest desperate for money. He had come out with something far more dangerous, a story he would carry to his grave, and a debt he would never regret paying. If this story made you think, support the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Here we share the stories the world is afraid to tell,